Once upon a time, in a small village, there lived a woman named Louise, whom everyone considered a blissful fool. She was reclusive and unattractive, and no one even knew how old she was. Her skin seemed smooth and wrinkle-free, but her gaze was as if she had long grown weary of everything in the world. However, Louise rarely focused her gaze on anyone's face. She was too withdrawn to communicate even with a glance. The strangest thing was that no one remembered how she had appeared in the village. After the war, everything had become chaotic. Many people left, while strangers arrived, and some stayed forever. Perhaps this woman was one of those wanderers searching for a better life. She took up residence in the outermost vacant house near the forest, a dilapidated and tiny one, and over the course of a decade or two, she let it fall into complete disrepair. Occasionally, a kind-hearted neighbor would fix her roof, only to mutter into his smoke-stained mustache afterward. No gratitude at all. The rainwater was drumming into a bucket from the ceiling. I fixed it, and now it's dry. But this Louise didn't even say thank you, let alone look me in the face. No one knew how she made a living or what she ate. She always wore the same sackcloth dress, its hem weighed down by dried mud. The same dress, yet she didn't smell of the thick musk of unwashed human secretions, but rather of a cellar and mold. Then one day, in the early 1960s, one of the local young men, after drinking too much vodka, barged into her house. Whether someone had egged him on, or his desire for some abstract femininity, was so strong that the object no longer mattered. It was a quiet, clear, full moon night in May, filled with the thick scents of blooming grass and awakened crickets. Earlier, the whole village had celebrated Victory Day, with an accordion playing, the smell of pies, and everyone eating, drinking, and making merry. The young man's name was Alex, and he was 25 years old. He burst into Louise's house, and even in the entryway, he felt uneasy. The house had a strange smell of emptiness and decay. Even Uncle Salazar, the village drunk, didn't have a house that smelled like this, though he had drunk away his soul back when Alex was still a baby. Uncle Salazar's house smelled of a warm stove, strong sweat, unwashed feet, sour milk, and a rotten floor rag. It was disgusting, but amidst the cacophony of foul odors, there was still a sense of life, albeit degraded. But Louise's house smelled as if it hadn't been cleaned in decades of a damp cellar, dusty curtains, and mold. Alex suddenly wanted to turn around and flee, but he convinced himself that it would be unmanly, so he moved forward, groping in the dark, as the windows were covered with some wrecks, blocking out the moonlight. His outstretched hands bumped into a door. It gave way and opened with a quiet creak. Alex cautiously stepped inside, bumping his head slightly on the lintel. Louise was short, and the doors in the house were suited to her height. In the darkness, Alex quickly lost his sense of direction, but suddenly someone stirred quietly in the corner, and the primal fear that most people feel in the dark in an unfamiliar place suddenly awakened the warrior and barbarian in him. With a short cry, Alex lunged forward. "Go away," came Louise's quiet, muffled voice, and Alex could have sworn he was hearing it for the first time. Many were convinced that the old woman from the outermost house had gone mute during the war, and had never recovered. She reached for the window, pulled back the curtain, and Alex finally saw her in the bluish moonlight. Her calm, ugly face looked lifeless. "Come on." He tried to speak cheerfully, but his voice cracked from excitement, and, annoyed with himself, he lashed out at Louise, punching her lifeless face. "Come on, come on. I'll be quick." She didn't resist, and her calmness gave him strength. She must have been dreaming about this, overjoyed and unable to believe her luck, he thought. She probably hasn't had a man in 20 years, if not longer. Louise was wrapped in rags, like a shroud. Alex managed to unbutton her woolen cardigan, but underneath was some kind of tattered garment, and deeper still something like nylon, slippery and cool to the touch. Finally, in frustration, he yanked at the rags, and they cracked, almost crumbling to dust in his hands. Louise lay just as silently, her arms at her sides like a corpse being prepared for washing. Her eyes were open, and somewhere in the back of his mind, Alex noted that they didn't shine. Dull eyes, like a doll's, but the volcanic lava in his blood was already boiling, ready to erupt and free him from the fire. And he hardly cared who opened the vent, a warm woman, a slobbery fist, or this grey doll. Louise's chest resembled empty canvas bags in which Alex's mother stored nuts he had gathered in the forest. Her breasts had no fullness or milky softness, and her nipples were like tree fungi, rough and dark. Something you wouldn't want to touch. At that moment, Alex's consciousness seemed to split in two. One part couldn't understand how anyone could desire this withered, waxen body. It was terrifying, disgusting, while the other, as if bewitched, simply obeyed the blind will, the impulse, and the passion. With his knee, he spread Louise's thighs just as cool and greyish, as if made of wax, and with one thrust, he entered her, to the part of Alex's mind that was terrified and repulsed. It felt as though his flesh was entering not a woman, but a jar of cold fermented milk. Inside, Louise was loose, cold, and damp, and so, after spilling himself into her, Alex left, fumbling with his pants on the way out. He felt as though he had been chopping wood all day, but he chalked up the weakness and dizziness to the vodka. He returned home and, without undressing, collapsed into bed. All night, he was tormented by nightmares. He dreamed that he was walking through the village cemetery, among the graves, and from all sides, dirt-covered hands reached out for him. They tried to grab his pant leg, their fingers icy and hard. A hum filled his ears. The lifeless voices pleaded, "Me too, me too, please, me too." Then, on the path ahead of him, a girl appeared. She stood with her back to him, fragile, short, with long wheat-colored hair cascading over her shoulders. She was wearing a wedding dress. Alex rushed toward her, as if she were a goddess savior. But then she slowly turned around, and it became clear that she, too, was dead. Her pale face was covered in greenish spots, her once plump upper lip half rotted, revealing her teeth, and her eyes were dull. "Me too, me too," she droned hollowly. "Come closer. They buried me in a wedding dress on purpose. I've been waiting for you." Alex woke up to his mother splashing icy water from a ladle into his face. "Have you lost your mind, you drunkard? You drank yourself senseless and screamed all night like I have nerves of steel." Several weeks passed. At first, Alex couldn't shake the feeling of melancholy, as if heavy wings had spread over him, blocking out the sunlight. Whether it was because the memories of that night with Louise poisoned his thoughts, or because his conscience tormented him, he grew worse with each passing day. Alex began to notice that the strange heaviness he had felt since that night was growing stronger. He couldn't explain what exactly was wrong, but the sensation of something invisible dragging him down became more intense with each day. He tried to distract himself from his torment by walking in the forest, or doing his usual chores. But even in the simplest tasks, strange lapses began to occur. His hands trembled, his thoughts grew muddled, and he lost track of time. And when he returned home, everything felt alien: his own house, his parents, even the ground beneath his feet. At first, Alex thought it was just the aftermath of his drinking, but it soon became clear that it wasn't just a hangover. He often felt as though something invisible was watching him, as if his steps were accompanied by someone's gaze. And despite all his efforts, he couldn't shake the obsessive feeling. One evening at sunset, as he walked through the forest, his gaze fell on the very spot where he and Louise had been that night. That corner, that door, behind which lay darkness and confusion. Alex approached the house, and his eyes fixed on the crumbling, dilapidated wall. Time had left deep marks on the house, but something inside compelled him to peer through the window. He felt his heart race. Through the cracks and dirty glass, he saw a figure standing in the dark corner of the room. It was Louise. The same as that night. The same gaze, the same calm, as if she had been waiting for his return. Alex stood frozen, unable to move. His breathing grew heavy, and his pulse quickened. He felt a chill run through his body, and suddenly, his mind went blank. Without realizing how it happened, he found himself inside the house. The door, which had been locked before, was now open, and the light in the room was dim, like a distant flicker. Louise stood in the same spot as before, and her eyes, they were looking straight at him, but they weren't alive. They were like two mirrors, filled with murky water. Alex raised his hand to his face, and his fingers froze when he felt a wet spot on his skin. Louise took a step toward him, and as she drew closer, he was overwhelmed by a sense of loss, a supernatural fear, as if he had already died but didn't know it yet. She reached out her hand. Alex couldn't tear his eyes away from her lifeless face. He knew he needed to run, but his body wouldn't obey. He was as if hypnotized, and with each step Louise took, he lost more of his connection to reality. When she stood right in front of him, her lips moved, uttering words that sounded unnatural. "Cold. You won't leave. We are all one." Alex finally snapped out of his trance and, gritting his teeth, took a step back. At that moment, the air turned liquid, and he felt his body begin to lose its form. His eyes, his soul, everything blurred, dissolving into the darkness. Louise stepped closer again, and their essences merged into one invisible, shapeless entity. No one knew what had happened to him. When he disappeared, Louise's house stood empty, and no one saw him again. But those who passed by the abandoned hut claimed that sometimes, in the silence of the night, they could hear muffled laughter, like echoes of long-forgotten souls. Rumors about Louise's house and Alex's disappearance spread through the village. Over the weeks and months, people began to avoid the place. The forest, which had once seemed ordinary, now appeared gloomy and sinister. The shadows seemed to grow longer, and the air grew heavier with each step, as if swallowing the very souls of those who dared to approach the cursed house. Louise stood before Alexei, her empty, black eyes seemingly penetrating the very depths of his soul. The air around him thickened, and the walls of the house began to slowly shift, as if the house itself were a living being, ready to consume him. Alexei tried to take a step back, but his legs seemed rooted to the floor. His friends stood beside him, their eyes now as empty as Louise's, their faces lifeless, like masks. "You won't leave," whispered Louise, her voice echoing like a sound from the distant past. "You've become part of this house. You've become part of me." Alexei felt his mind beginning to unravel. Memories of his past life, of the village, his friends, his family, all of it began to dissolve into the darkness. He tried to resist, but the more he struggled, the tighter the house seemed to grip him, like a boa constrictor squeezing its prey. Suddenly, an image of his sister flashed in his mind. She was the only one who remained a connection to reality for him. Her face, her voice, her smile, it all seemed so distant, yet so real. Alexei realized he had to find her, that she was somewhere here, in this house, in this darkness. "Where is she?" he whispered, his voice trembling but resolute. "Where is my sister?" Louise slowly turned her head, her black eyes flickering as if a spark of life had briefly appeared in them. "She's here," Louise replied, her voice like the whisper of the wind. "But you'll never find her. She's become part of us, just like you." Alexei felt his body beginning to lose its form. His hands became transparent, as if he were turning into a shadow. He realized he had very little time left. He had to find her before it was too late. Summoning his last reserves of strength, he stepped forward, passing through Louise as if she were mist. He found himself in a long corridor, its walls covered in cracks, the floor creaking beneath his feet. At the end of the corridor, he saw a faint light coming from a half-open door. Alexei's heart raced. He approached the door and gently pushed it open. The room he entered was small and almost empty. In the center stood an old wooden table, on which lay a tattered book. On the wall hung a portrait of a young woman with long, light hair. Alexei immediately recognized her. It was his sister, but her face was pale, her eyes as empty as Louise's. "You've found her," came Louise's voice, who suddenly appeared behind him. But she's no longer who she was. She's become part of this house, just like you. Alexei felt his body beginning to dissolve. He reached out toward the portrait, but his fingers passed through it as if it was smoke. He realized it was already too late. His sister, like himself, had become part of this cursed place. "Why?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why did you do this?" Louise stepped closer to him, her face as still as a mask. "This house has always been hungry," she replied. "It feeds on the souls of those who enter. I was the first, but now I am its keeper. And you, your sister, and all the others, you've become part of it. You will live here forever." Alexei felt his consciousness beginning to fade. The last thing he saw was his sister's face, slowly dissolving into the darkness. Then everything was swallowed by the void. Since then, Louise's house stood abandoned, but those who passed by sometimes heard whispers coming from within its walls. It was said that on full moon nights, shadows could be seen moving in the windows, and if one got too close, they could hear voices calling them inside. One day, a wanderer came to the village. He was dressed in old, tattered clothes, and his eyes were filled with determination. He asked the villagers about Louise's house, but they only shook their heads and advised him to stay away from the place. "I have to find her," he said. "My daughter is missing. I know she's here." No one tried to stop him. They knew that those who searched for the missing in Louise's house never returned. But the wanderer was relentless. He made his way to the house, and as he crossed the threshold, the door quietly closed behind him. The next morning, the villagers found his hat lying at the doorstep of the house. But the wanderer himself was never seen again. It was said that strange sounds had been heard from the house that night: laughter, crying, and whispers that sounded like the voices of many people. Louise's house continued to stand, as it always had, shrouded in mystery and fear, and anyone who dared to come too close disappeared, becoming part of its eternal darkness.